Throughout the last decade, horror games have become stunningly beautiful in their very own, very morbid way. Whether it's a corpse controlled by some alien entity, a human that got taken over by a brain-controlling fungus, or parasite-infested farmers in some small Spanish village, the developers of those respective games did everything in their power to place every single gruesome pixel just right. Not only that, but the movements, attacks, and general responses of those creatures to your very own inputs and behavior have also become so precise, fluent, and logical that it's simply baffling. You see, things weren't always this way. Just a few decades ago, this funny looking cluster of pixels was the very definition of blood-curdling video game horror, scaring the crap out of millions of players, which seems pretty bizarre when you compare it to the nightmares we have to face in modern titles. What is even crazier though, is that despite putting myself through many of those recent titles and thoroughly enjoying them, I still never felt quite as scared as I did back when playing on my PlayStation 1. And I know that many people feel the exact same way. So to figure out how this could possibly be scarier than this, let's look at some of the titles that first defined the horror genre many years ago and figure out just what exactly it was that made them that much spookier than today's titles. Let's jump right in. One of the key requirements for crafting a good game, regardless of its genre, is that the atmosphere needs to fit the events that are happening on the screen. Just like an easygoing, silly soundtrack and exaggerated sound effects fit the theme of an orange bandicoot who needs to collect fruit and stomp on plants, a good horror game needs to do whatever it possibly can to subtly add suspense, tension, and fear to the very world it takes place in, so that the eventual confrontation with whatever you will have to face will be so much more terrifying. The first Silent Hill is a prime example of masterfully handling the elements I just described, proven by the fact that the game is nearing its 25th birthday and, despite that, is still considered to be one of the best horror games of all time. If we look at the game in its entirety, Silent Hill is a fantastic title, but when it comes to its atmosphere and environmental design specifically, the game is simply second to none. The moment you first set foot in the city of Silent Hill, you are immediately greeted by a seemingly empty city, covered in thick fog, and what stood out the most to me was, ironically, how incredibly quiet everything was. From the very first moment on, there's an eerie silence that accompanies the thick fog and the empty city, which really makes it clear that you're isolated and that there's no escape from this place. All you can really hear for the majority of your time in Silent Hill are Harry's footsteps. And while monsters, and whatever the hell that is, are quite scary, it is really the tension and anxiety that builds up before those encounters that stress you out so much and really always keep you on edge. All of these factors get amplified by the radio that you equip at the very beginning of the game, as it starts to play a static sound whenever you're about to run into enemies, further adding to the excessive fear and stress you've built up. So while Silent Hill masterfully knows how to pull the strings to convey fear through silence, isolation, and mostly anticipation before things finally blow up in your face, Nightmare Creatures 2 is a perfect counterpart to this rather subtle approach, demonstrating just as masterfully how constant chaos, confrontation, and brutality can tickle the same spot in your brain and scare the absolute crap out of you in a very similar way. Where Silent Hill often had you walk empty streets and strongly relied on having a lot of build-up before finally confronting you with actual enemies or threats, Nightmare Creatures 2 immediately shoves you face first into its excessively violent and disturbing world. Not only do you start the game inside a literal rubber room, but this weird guy here who is doing psychotic dances and is wrapped in bandages is actually the protagonist. Rather than a police officer or average Joe like the ones we get in most other horror games, this time around our protagonist is just kind of pathetic and broken. We get to control a man who is mentally unstable, scared to death, and takes multiple seconds to even gather the courage to leave his bed and begin his journey. Now, I can't really put my finger on it, but there's something that is just incredibly uncomfortable about being in charge of a character that is just so clearly unwell and disturbed. Sure, Harry Mason from Silent Hill seemed a lot more competent at first glance, and wasn't wrapped in bandages from head to toe, but, as we'll soon find out, Herbert is much more experienced in battle and can pull some crazy moves to get rid of any hostile encounters. So technically speaking, he's a lot more adept at combat and in survival skills. Despite that, it felt a whole lot more comfortable playing as Harry Mason, even though his odds of making it through the situation he was in were way worse. He, like almost all the other Silent Hill characters too, was a pretty likable and relatable guy. unlike this weirdo over here. So rather than just having to deal with a bizarre and disturbing environment and grotesque creatures, even the very protagonist himself could easily pass as a monster or enemy. Things don't get much better once we leave our room either. The corridors are bleak and narrow, things are randomly exploding, everything is on fire, and you're immediately confronted with the very first enemy, only seconds after starting the game. So to say that the starting conditions in Nightmare Creatures 2 are chaotic is a bit of an understatement. Now, while all of the things we've just been introduced to are quite hard to process already, the game doubles down here and delivers a cutscene that is so disturbing and unsettling that it burned itself into my memory and I could never really forget it. Just after dealing with your first enemy, who admittedly sounds kinda goofy when you smack the crap out of him, you're now introduced to a whole different kind of enemy. Looking back at this cutscene almost 22 years after first experiencing it, I think I can now finally grasp what made this specific encounter traumatize me as much as it did. And not only that, but it furthermore serves as a perfect demonstration as to why this kind of enemy is actually much scarier than this one. The difference lies in the very fact that one is realistically designed and identifiable, and the other one is simply this thing. Kind of looks like a human is supposed to look, and is even specifically classified to be female since it is also butt naked, yet there's just something off about it, besides the obvious blood-curdling screams. Now, one argument that I keep hearing a lot whenever I look into why so many people still find old horror media so scary, despite the graphics being obsolete and many of the tropes that were used back then being very silly in hindsight, is that it is exactly because of these low poly models that represent enemies and environments. You see, a popular explanation that is generally accepted at this point seems to be that our mind uses our imagination to complete the rather rough-looking enemies and environments, turning them into something much worse than they actually are. And honestly, while I can totally see why people argue this way, I actually kind of disagree. Sure, the low poly models aren't even comparable to characters and environments we see these days. But at the same time, comparing them to a jigsaw puzzle that is missing pieces and has to be filled by our imagination just isn't the case. The models are what they are. They are recognizable and clear enough to be identified for what they want to represent. Sure, you won't be able to see the sun shine through the ear cartilage of a PS1 zombie like you can with Arthur Morgan in Red Dead Redemption 2. But saying that our imagination has to fill gaps here and make these models scarier than what they actually are just seems really far-fetched to me. In fact, many of the characters and enemy models actually look so bizarre and low resolution that under different circumstances, they are actually quite funny to look at. What I think is much more plausible is my own 200 IQ theory, so listen up and tell me what you think. In my opinion, what makes these older horror games so weirdly bizarre and scary is the fact that technical progress happened to be at a very odd stage of development at the time that these games came out. It was just far enough to mimic three-dimensional structures and movement enough to be identifiable for us at first glance, and at the same time was just not far enough at all to really convince us that this is, in fact, the kind of plausible and believable movement we can compare or relate to something we know. What that results in is that you will find yourself completely in awe at times at how well, smooth and believable certain elements of the horror games of that time were designed, and at the same time you will also witness exaggerated ragdoll physics to the point where it was almost comical, or movements which were just off. The same goes for the following cutscene in the original Silent Hill. What you have just seen is, without any exaggeration, nothing short of a goddamn cinematic masterpiece. There is no soundtrack that could underline the events on the screen better, and it is simply incredible that Team Silent was able to put together something with this level of quality in animation and CGI. Remember, the first Silent Hill came out in 1999, so the fact that they managed to put something this lifelike and graphically beautiful together is, in and of itself, just an incredible feat. And yet, even here, there are technical limitations at work that stop Lisa's movement from being all the way believable. Something about her stumbling, her movement and her behavior just seems off. And as I have explained before, it is exactly this kind of offness that tickles a very specific spot in people's brains and scares the crap out of them. This specific kind of mimicry of human or at least believable movement, speech and overall motion that is almost convincing enough to understand and make sense of, but is still lacking a certain kind of polish to be fully believable and to correctly categorize. Another thing that I've noticed quite often in older titles is that they are not afraid to confront you with long stretches of nothing but absolute silence. Meanwhile, in basically every single title that came out in the last 2 decades, it is basically commonplace to have some OST or at the very least some environmental background sounds playing. And while it was only natural and made a lot of sense to add these things from a design perspective, losing this very raw silence that you can still find in lots of older titles definitely took away from the horror too. In a sense, all of this was a very natural change, thanks to the major technological improvements that concerned the gaming industry as a whole, transforming the pixelated picture we saw on screen into a higher definition one with massive leaps as time went on. And while there isn't a single other video game genre I can think of that didn't massively profit from these monumental changes, horror games seem to get less and less unnerving with each new batch of polish and features that were added to them. I know this is hard to grasp if you haven't played an older title in a long time, or maybe never have, but I really encourage you to go give it a shot and tell me how you perceive this very bare-bone experience. Because, to be honest with you, nothing I've ever come across in modern horror titles has ever come close to scaring me quite the same way. There is a very popular video circling the internet where a talented player shows off his gameplay mechanics after hundreds of hours of gameplay in the Resident Evil 4 remake. And admittedly, it looks really smooth and pretty impressive to see how skill-based the combat in horror games has become. It can be argued that nowadays, in most survival horror games that give you any chance to fight back against your enemies, your skill is the deciding factor in how well you do against hordes of zombies or other nightmarish creatures. And the one reason why this works and your efficiency and skill are constantly rewarded by being able to preserve a lot more resources than a bad player is because the game is fair, well balanced, and to some degree always in favor of the player. Resident Evil 4 is a perfect example of this, because it uses something called adaptive or dynamic difficulty. What that means in practice is that depending on many different factors concerning your gameplay, such as the amount of damage you take, how many resources you carry, or even things like your overall accuracy or times you died, the game will automatically adjust itself to be closer to your personal skill level. So for example, if you're a very experienced player and perform very well, enemies will slowly but surely become more aggressive, attack faster, and get much tankier. Whereas a bad player who struggles with the game from the first moment on will find more resources, take less damage when hit by an enemy, and will also need way less bullets to put enemies down than the skill player did. So the game quite literally adapts beyond the difficulty you chose at the beginning to give you the perfect, tailor-made experience. Not to mention that it is basically an unwritten rule at this point that there's a relatively smooth learning curve. Starting with a tutorial that makes you familiar with the controls as you traverse the environment, and then eventually has you fight one sole enemy. The games basically do as much as they can to make the experience fun for you and try to deliver an experience that feels fair and engaging. Sure, it sucked that you died to that one monster that got the jump on you, but if you restart from the last checkpoint and play your cards right, you will certainly manage to overcome the challenge without breaking too much of a sweat. Now, old horror games play kinda differently. And by that I mean that they absolutely do not give a single shit about how and if you manage to make it through the game, let alone adjust their difficulties to your skill level. What's that? You need a tutorial? Fuck you, noob. Read the handbook or order the survival guide from page 19. Hitboxes? Nah, get WWE'd by this weird Sandman creature and try again. Say what? You want to know where the hell you're aiming, so you know if you're gonna hit your shots and can preserve precious ammo? Sucks to be you, idiot. I swear guys, if there's one sole point I want you to take away from this entire video, it is that old video games were absolutely fucking ruthless when it came to easing you into the game. Tutorials were non-existent, and it's not like nowadays, where a specific control scheme got widely accepted as the ideal one and every developer just copy-pasted it with some slight adjustments. Back in the PlayStation 1 era, at least for the majority of titles, starting a new game really meant starting a new game. And you would have to take your time to figure out which action is triggered by each specific button on your controller. Now, some games were generally quite intuitive, like Resident Evil or Silent Hill, where the learning by doing approach really works. But in other titles, like Nightmare Creatures 2 specifically, you were just absolutely fucked if you went in blind. There are fatalities every time you were an enemy's health down close to zero, but no indication as to how they're triggered. There is a weird looking gas mask that triggers a very strong attack, but it is very likely that you will just accidentally hit the wrong button and waste it. And even when performing very elemental tasks, like traversing the environment, controls can get in your way, as I nearly drowned in the first swimming section because I had no clue how to even surface again. Things don't stop there either, because reliable hitboxes and animations that correctly indicate the attack range or pattern of your enemies either only exist in a very rudimentary way or are straight up not a thing. So while almost every modern title has this very subtle, invisible hand that gently guides you through the game without you even really noticing it, older games just really didn't care about not frustrating you and were more than happy to send you back to your last manual save when you died, making the overall experience while playing the game feel much more tense and uncomfortable. Now, I've touched on this before in a part of the video that talks about the overall design and atmosphere, but in gameplay too, technical limitations are probably the key reason why most things were as they were. Remember, we're talking about an era where Tekken 3 was the gold standard for graphics and earned universal praise for being beautiful. Now, after all this praise I've given older horror games for their atmosphere, design and gameplay mechanics, and explaining how these are key features that cause this very specific combination of emotion and fear in us that newer games just can't seem to reproduce, it is important to remember that these games were, like anything else, products of their time, naturally created with the objective in mind to push the existing technology to the maximum and produce a fantastic product, but equally so held back by the limitations of the technological progress of the late 90s or early 2000s. Take the fog in Silent Hill for example. It is a universally praised feature that arguably defines the title and was deemed so important that it would be featured in every single Silent Hill title since. Understandably so, as the empty, wide-spaced areas of the different Silent Hills would never be the same without the thick layer of fog that hides all kinds of abominations that are just waiting to jump scare you. Funny enough, this quintessential feature was originally only implemented because of hardware limitations of the original PlayStation. The fog was the perfect alibi to cover areas that were further away, only having the console render the environment that was closest to the player. Gameplay mechanics are a very similar story. I'm pretty sure that clunky tank controls and a camera that would often work against you rather than show you what's approaching were not necessarily meant to be that hindersome, but rather were just the best that many developers could manage to come up with back then. In hindsight, this exact combination of very specific circumstances was arguably the best that ever happened to the horror game genre. Now, it is worth noting that some things are genuinely completely subjective and up to personal taste, which is why I totally believe that some people cannot wrap their heads around how something that looks and plays like the original Resident Evil could be scarier than the recent titles of the same series. Nor would they understand why they should even bother and try out a game that is nearly 3 decades old and obsolete in many ways. But for anyone who was either lucky enough to be around when these genre-defining titles first came out, or decided to give them a shot many years after they first premiered, it becomes quite obvious that there's depth and substance behind the superficial clunkiness and bad graphics. The biggest testament to these classics that weighs heavier than any other argument I've mentioned so far is simply the fact that they are even mentioned nowadays and have stayed relevant throughout all those years, despite the incredible competition they had. Silent Hill and the original Resident Evil are held to such a high standard in fact that even 25 years after they first came out, developers are still trying to reproduce the same atmosphere and design those titles had, and are consequently also trying to evoke the same emotions those titles caused the players to feel back then. And even for other titles that have vanished into obscurity over time, there's often still a loyal fanbase begging developers to give them a remake, once again proving that there's just something about those older titles that is timeless and deeply important to the media as a whole. So even if you prefer your gore and monsters in stunningly beautiful high definition and detail, you might want to give those original, timeless classics a shot regardless. After all, It is those bizarre and funny looking games that laid the groundwork for what we have nowadays. And who knows, you may just end up realizing that the fog enshrouded cities of Silent Hill or the very uncomfortable mechanics of Resident Evil are just a tad bit scarier than those modern titles after all. Friends, we have once again made it to the end of the video. Please let me know your thoughts and feedback in the comments. If you like this video, feel free to leave a like and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to stay up to date and get alerted whenever I drop a new video. Most importantly though, thank you so much for spending your precious time by watching my content. It really means the world to me. See you in the next video, friends. Take care and be well.